Good morning. Welcome to Haskell Hall at the Episcopal Church of the Redeemer in Ruston, Louisiana. We're across Tech Drive from Louisiana Tech University, so we're very much a university town and very much a university parish in a way. This is session one of a 6-session class on the Corinthian Letters. In case you're wondering, I'm going to tell you about all 8 Corinthian letters. How about that? Come now. What is this? Okay, that seems good. Our normal class, time for class, is we have to start at 9:15 and we absolutely have to end at 10:10. And that is really important, ending at 10:10, because we have a 10:30 service and I have to get dressed. And sometimes people want to talk to me about things about the service before the service, so I have to really get out of here at 10:10. Okay, I recommend that you get an accurate modern translation of the Bible. I recommend strongly that you do not use paraphrases of the Bible like the Living Bible from the 70s and the Message. Particularly the Message is a lot more entertaining than it is accurate. It doesn't claim to be a translation. It's a paraphrase. There are a lot of good translations out there. The Revised Standard Version is very good. It came out in the New Testament in 1946 and then a second edition in 1971. The New Revised Standard Version, which is what you hear in church, in Episcopal churches usually, was published in 1989. The Revised English Bible was a revision of the New English Bible, which came out in the 60s for the New Testament. The REB came out in the 80s. The New American Bible is a Roman Catholic translation and absolutely excellent. The Jerusalem Bible in the 60s and the New Jerusalem Bible, and even an update of that, have come out. There's also a 2011 update of the New International Version, which is a version translated by all conservative evangelicals. And so the New Revised Standard Version updated edition is being published almost as we speak. And so a committee of the Society of Biblical Literature was asked by the National Council of Churches to do an update of the NRSV, since the NRSV was from 1989. If you don't have a Bible, get one of these, I would recommend. I know the editors. The first one is the HarperCollins Study Bible, edited by Harry Attridge at Yale. And the New Oxford Annotated Bible is edited by several people, including Mark Brettler, who is at Duke, who is an excellent Hebrew Bible scholar. Anyway, the New Testament, we know a lot about the New Testament, and I want you to do the math. First of all, the earliest collection of early Christian literature is the Pauline Corpus. And I'm going to tell you what the Pauline Corpus is. But the Pauline Corpus are 14 letters, well, 13 letters and one document that is not really a letter, and they are attributed to Paul, or have been attributed to Paul in the tradition. They're not all by Paul. But the Pauline Corpus is the earliest collection of early Christian writings. The next earliest is the Gospels. I would not date Mark before 70, and I would date Matthew and Luke after Mark, and I would date the Gospel of John in the very late 1st century or the early 2nd century, in the form in which we have it now. The Acts of the Apostles is a historical book. There are 7 letters that are not written to any one group of people. Paul's letters are all written to a particular church or to a particular person, right? And the general letters, or Catholic epistles, are just sort of written. James, and that includes James, Jude, 1st and 2nd Peter, and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then the Revelation of John, or the Revelation to John. And if you do the math, those should add up to 27 documents, which are in the New Testament. In the Pauline Corpus, or as my European colleagues call it, the Corpus Paulinum, It consists of 14 documents that circulated in the early church that were attributed to Paul at one time or another. Hebrews was not always attributed to Paul, but part of the time it was. And here they are in the order in which you have them in the New Testament, and I put 1st and 2nd Corinthians in red. Romans is the first, and it's the longest. Philemon only has 25 verses, and it's the shortest. And then Hebrews doesn't claim to be by Paul; it's anonymous. That doesn't mean, because we're calling them the Pauline Corpus, that doesn't mean they're all really likely by Paul. We don't really have there's all sorts of things that we don't know about the first century church. And so we have to use our human reason to figure out whether they were really written by the person to whom they are attributed. And these 7 letters from Romans, the letter to the Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon, we do not have any problem with them being written by Paul. We believe that they are absolutely positively written by Paul. Now there is a little chunk of 1 Corinthians that probably wasn't written by Paul. It's the chunk that says women are supposed to stay silent in church. 1 Corinthians 14, 33b through 36. We don't think that's by Paul. But nonetheless, all the rest of it seems to be by Paul. There are other letters in the Pauline Corpus that we have names for. Colossians and Ephesians have a different theology than Paul has. And 2 Thessalonians is kind of different as well. And so those 3 letters, Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians, are called the Deutero-Pauline letters, which means they are sort of in a second level of authorship by Paul, which is to say they're close to Paul in a way, but they're not by Paul himself. They were written by people who admired Paul very much after Paul's death. And then the pastoral letters are 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus. And they presuppose a different way of structuring the church. They presuppose that the apostles are dead. And they presuppose that the 2 major deputies of Paul during his lifetime, Timothy and Titus, are being told, okay, now that I'm about to croak, here's how you've got to run the church, as if they wouldn't have known, see? So 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, especially 1 Timothy and Titus, are very interested in church order, namely how the church should be structured. And then an anonymous document, which is not a letter at all, is called the letter to the Hebrews. The King James Version refers to it as St. Paul's letter to the Hebrews, but the evidence certainly is otherwise. Well, Paul was a real person. And so Paul was called as an apostle by the risen Christ. In other words, Paul experienced a vision or a revelation of the risen Christ. And he speaks of it in 1 Corinthians 15. And we believe, following church tradition, we believe that he was called as an apostle by the risen Christ in the same year or in the year following Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. And the 2 likely dates are 30 CE or 33 CE, 33 being a little more likely. CE is what we now call AD. Everybody doesn't believe that Jesus is the Lord, like Jewish scholars, for example. And so CE means the Common Era, and it's sort of a neutral way of saying, the dates that we're using. And so before the Common Era is BCE, and Common Era is CE. We've been using that in scholarship since the 1970s. Paul was very likely put to death by beheading because he claimed to be a Roman citizen. He was a Roman citizen because he was a citizen of Tarsus. And he was put to death by beheading according to church tradition while Nero was emperor of Rome. And this most likely was within the years 62 to 64 CE. And therefore, between 33 and 62, a 30-year period, was the very long career of St. Paul the Apostle. and that was a humongously long and extraordinarily productive apostolic career. The major thing that Paul did during his time as an apostle was not to write letters. The major thing that Paul did during his lifetime was to minister to and plant churches, and to try to get churches out of the messes that they got themselves into when he was not in town, okay? And so letter writing was only a little part, maybe 5% or less, of what Paul did during his lifetime. And so we have to keep that in mind as we interpret his letters. And how do you interpret Paul's letters? Well, we have methods that we use. Generally speaking, we use a group of methods which together are called historical criticism. In other words, the text may say X, Y, Z, this happened, but when we do historical criticism, we want to study the historical background of the text, and we want to study the historical features of what it says in the text, and then, learning what we can learn from the social and historical context of the letters. And so what we want to ask frequently is, what is behind the text? Which is to say, why did Paul write this letter? Why did the early church preserve this letter? We also use something called form criticism of letters, based on the typical form of letters in this era, which in this era is called the Hellenistic Roman period. In Greek, the kind of Greek that Paul wrote was Hellenistic Greek. And the Hellenistic period is after Alexander the Great died, and his generals and successors divided up the world into kingdoms like the Seleucid kingdom and the Ptolemaic kingdom and other places. And when they did that, they imposed Greek as the language to be used on all of these conquered peoples that Alexander the Great had conquered. And so they used a form of Attic Greek. By the way, Attic Greek is not the opposite of Cellar Greek. Attica is the Greek word for Athens. And so Athenian Greek in the 5th and 4th century is the golden age of Greek. And that kind of Greek was imposed on all of these provinces. And so as they did that, Hellenistic Greek picked up certain aspects of these other languages of these conquered people. And so we call that Hellenistic Greek. And the New Testament was written in that dialect of Greek known as Hellenistic Greek. Then we also have spent a lot of time trying to figure out the structure of letters based on the structure of speeches in the Greek and Roman period. And Robert Jewett and my book, The Corinthian Correspondence, features rhetorical criticism. I am known by a number of my colleagues as a rhetorical critic of Paul. Literary criticism, you'll see that in the book if you read it. Namely, we're looking frequently for rough transitions in the letters that look like, okay, here's a part of a letter, and then here is another part of the letter that would make a lot of sense if they were joined. But in the middle, there is some business here in the middle that doesn't seem to fit. And so when you're trying to figure out is it an integral letter or not, or are there multiple letters embedded in 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, as we think they are, you are doing something that has traditionally been called literary criticism. And so in our book, Bob Jewett did that literary criticism, particularly in chapters 2 and particularly chapter 2 and particularly chapter 3. And then he showed how these Corinthian letters were edited to form 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians. And when he did that, there was editing that went on, and redaction is another fancy term for editing. So anyway, those are methods that we use in our book. The big historical problem with Paul is not that we don't have enough information about Paul. The problem with Paul is we have so much information. The problem is, what do you do with all that information? And does all this information that we have in the New Testament about Paul, does it all mesh together nicely? Or are there bits and pieces of what we read in one source that are in some tension with what we read in other sources? So the problem is, with Paul is not that we don't know anything about Paul. The problem is we've got a lot of information about Paul from his letters, and we've got a fair amount, quite a bit of information about Paul from the book of Acts, and they frequently don't agree. And so you have to decide sometimes when what Acts says about Paul is in conflict with what Paul says about Paul. You have to decide what to do about that contradiction. And so here is what we do. Namely, you have a lot of material that is what Acts says about Paul, and you have considerably more material from Paul's own letters. And so the big question that we always ask in historical criticism is, how do you know anything about Paul? By the way, when I was teaching overseas at Corinthian College in Barbados, I was teaching a bunch of Bajans. You know, you've heard of Cajuns. These were Bajans, Barbadians. And I said, well, what do you do in a criminal trial? Does the judge instruct the jury in, you have to find that this person is guilty or innocent, but if you find him guilty, you have to find that he's guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? That's how it is in America. And in Barbados, you have to find them guilty, if you're on the jury, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Okay? I got news for you. When we figure out what is what about Paul, we can't do it beyond a shadow of a doubt. And frequently, we can't even do it beyond a reasonable doubt. And so what we really have to do is we have to be content when we study the ancient world. We have to be content with probability. You can talk about what's possible. You know, I can say the sky is green. That's possible, but it's not really green. See? So what we have to talk about is what is probable. So when we say, you know, what happened during Paul's lifetime, or what happened in the background of this letter, or what this letter seems to mean, we have to do that on the basis of what is probably true rather than what is certainly true. And I realize that that may not be what you were taught in Sunday school when you were 8 years old about the Bible. Sorry. But when you look at what happened in the ancient world, you have to be content with probability rather than certainty. And of course, when there is probability and not certainty, then that means that people like me, we get to go to meetings and disagree with each other. And we get to write books and disagree with each other. And my colleagues get to write articles and reviews of that book, and they will disagree with me. So we have to be content, given that we're talking about not this century, but we're talking about the first century when Paul lived and wrote. We have to be very content with probability and make the best case that we can make for what we are trying to say happened in Paul's lifetime and as the background of these letters. I wish that we had more in the way of certainty, but I am quite convinced that we don't. And so you get a lot of problems. And so in 1950, a fellow named John Knox wrote an extremely important book called Chapters in a Life of Paul. And in 1950, he argued very, very successfully that what was really needed was to rank the sources of Paul's life. And so he ranked the letters of Paul as primary sources, the only primary sources. And he ranked the Acts of the Apostles as a secondary source. And that has been very influential in our guild. And it inspired two friends of mine to write dissertations on that problem. And one was my teacher, Robert Jewett, who wrote a dissertation called, that part about chronology was called A Chronology of Paul's Life, or Dating Paul's Life. And then Gerd Ludemann in Göttingen, where I studied when I was a Fulbright scholar, wrote his second book was called Paul, Apostle to the Gentiles, Studies in Chronology. And so Gerd Ludemann, the late Gerd Ludemann, says that he wrote a chronology of Paul based only on the letters. my teacher, Bob Jewett, wrote a chronology of Paul based on what was in the letters and also what was in Acts that was not in conflict with what's in the letters. So he let a little bit more of Acts into the database than Ludeman did or than John Knox said that you should. So there's been quite a discussion about that since the 80s. But nonetheless, the writer of Acts doesn't know anything about Paul writing letters. Can you figure that out? If he was a protege of Paul, if he was Luke and was a protege of Paul, you would sort of expect that a protege of Paul would know something about Paul writing letters to problematic congregations. And you would also expect that if we are going to use Acts as a primary source, it would certainly be nice to know who wrote it. How can you have a primary source that you don't know who wrote it, see? And both Luke and Acts are anonymous. So since we don't know who wrote Acts, and we don't know who wrote volume 1 of Acts, which is Luke, we cannot reasonably consider Acts a primary source for the life of Paul. And so it is most reasonable that Acts must be treated as a secondary source for the life of Paul rather than as a primary source. Okay? The other thing is the Corinthian letters themselves, irrespective of what you read in Acts, the Corinthian letters themselves are just unbelievably important. They tell us more about congregational life and the problems of congregational life in early Christian churches than in any other letter or group of letters in the Pauline Corpus or any other part of the New Testament. If you want to know what churches are like or should be like, and if you want to know what churches now and then should not be like, you should read the Corinthian letters. It also shows Paul and the Corinthians in a lengthy and bitter conflict. Other invading missionaries were involved in the opposition to Paul, and it was a sharp and painful conflict. And Paul wrote a sharp and painful letter, 2 Corinthians 10 through 13, that was part of that conflict. It was a result of the conflict and became a part of the conflict. The theological importance of the Corinthian letters is very great. You cannot overestimate it. In 1 Corinthians 15, you have a very extended disquisition on the meaning of the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of Christians, and the evidence that Paul has that he's telling the Corinthians. There were Corinthians who denied the resurrection, see? And Paul has this long chapter 15, of 1 Corinthians, telling them, here are the reasons why we believe that Christ was resurrected. Namely, people saw it, right? Even Paul himself. In 1 Corinthians 3 and 4, there's a lot about apostleship and being a good follower of Jesus Christ and what it is to be an apostle. Paul is comparing himself to Apollos, who was an apostle who came into the Corinthian church after Paul. In 1 Corinthians 11, there is a narrative of the institution of the Lord's Supper, as Paul calls the Eucharist. And that is the earliest document that says what went on with Jesus and the apostles, at the Lord's Supper. This is earlier than the Gospels. So 1 Corinthians 11 is earlier than any of the Gospels. So it shows that Paul was already teaching in the 50s of the first century about the Lord's Supper in the Corinthian church, and the Corinthian church were getting it wrong. So he has to give them this information in 1 Corinthians 11. In 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, Paul is handling the conflict about meat that was bought in the pagan marketplace. What happens to this meat that I bought? I couldn't go to the Kroger or the Brookshires. I bought it in the marketplace, and this marketplace was within earshot of the local temple. And so this meat that I just bought, this fresh meat that I bought, was probably offered in pagan sacrifice in one of the nearby temples. And there were Christians who believed that you should not eat this meat if it had been offered in pagan worship. And so Paul deals with that conflict in 1 Corinthians 8 and 10, and how he's dealing with it is interrupted by chapter 9, frankly. In 1 Corinthians 1 through 4, the first 4 chapters, of 1 Corinthians, Paul rakes them over the coals about factionalism. In 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, Paul talks about spiritual gifts. And in our epistle today at church, 1 Corinthians 12, chapter 12, verse 12 and following, there is Paul's teaching about the church being the body of Christ. And the body of Christ, well, yeah, it's got a whole bunch of different diverse body parts, but these diverse body parts all make up the single body of Christ. And therefore, the Corinthian church, you should not be factionalized, you should be unified, right? 2 Corinthians 5 is a packed chapter about Christ. And in particular, 2 Corinthians 5:21, oh my God, is that packed. For our sake, us as Christians, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, namely Jesus. God made Jesus to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. You could spend semesters and years just unpacking that, okay? That's deeply, deeply, deeply theological. And so it's impossible to escape the conclusion that without 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the church and Christian theology would be extremely different than they have been for the last 2,000 years. Now, I've got friends, as Facebook friends, Facebook colleagues, who think that it's okay for, maybe the Christian church should not be like it's been for the last 2,000 years, and the early church got it wrong. I don't agree with that, but nonetheless, whether or not you like Paul or whether or not you like the early church and what the early church came up with in terms of theology and such, to my way of thinking, if you're an educated person, you really want to know about Christianity and how Christianity came into being. And you can't really get there unless you really study the letters of Paul. Let's take a look. I hope you don't have, some of you have Bibles and some don't. Well, anyway, let's take a look in 1 Corinthians 5:9. I see a Bible or two. Bill, would you read that? 1 Corinthians 5:9.
Oh. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with immoral men. Not at all meaning the immoral of this world, or the greedy and robbers, or idolaters, since you would need to go out of the world. But rather, I wrote to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother, if he is guilty of immorality or greed, or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or robber, not even to eat with any such one. Okay,
that's enough. Did you hear what he said in that first verse that he read? I wrote you. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5:9, I wrote you, the aorist tense, a past tense, referring to a letter that he wrote in the past that was a letter against immorality. So that's a letter that is mentioned in 1 Corinthians that was a letter against immorality or associating with immoral people. How about that? So that's a letter that 1 Corinthians mentions that is a letter that Paul wrote prior to 1 Corinthians. Did you catch that? Very important. Now, somebody read 2 Corinthians 2:3 through 10. Bill, would you do that? 2 Corinthians 2:3 through 10.
2:3 through 10. And I was with you in weakness and in much fear and trembling. And my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God.
You are reading 1 Corinthians. I was hoping that you would read 2 Corinthians. Okay? Did you notice how I could tell the difference? All right. 2 Corinthians 2:3 and following, okay?
And I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice. For I felt sure, all of you, that my joy would be the joy of you all. For I wrote you out of much affliction and anguish of heart, and with many tears.
Aha! I wrote you. Past tense, right? The aorist tense, sort of the generalized past tense. Greek has 4 past tenses. But I wrote you, and I wrote you out of anguish of heart and with many tears. Keep that in mind, okay? Now, read just the very, very beginning of 1 Corinthians 7:1 and 1 Corinthians 8:1, okay? You're doing a great job. 1 Corinthians 7:1 and 1 Corinthians 8:1.
1 Corinthians.
Yes.
7:1 and 8:1. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote.
That's enough.
Okay.
The Corinthians wrote Paul, right? They wrote Paul and asked for his advice on particular matters. And he gives them that advice in the rest of 1 Corinthians 7, okay? And then what does 8:1 say?
Now, concerning food offered to idols.
That could very well be another matter that they wrote about. 1 Corinthians 7 is where he tells virgins it's better to stay a virgin rather than to get married. Singleness is better than marriedness. I wish somebody would tell search committees in the Episcopal Church that. But anyway, they don't really believe it. And then he also says that slaves, yeah, you can get your freedom if you can, but after all, the second coming is coming very soon, so why don't you not? And then in chapters 8:1 and following, he says, concerning meat offered to idols. And apparently the Corinthians had written him a letter asking about those two things, okay? Okay, now, so if you believe that Paul wrote other letters, as in 1 Corinthians 5:9, I wrote you not to associate with immoral people, especially those who are fellow Christians. And then they wrote Paul a letter. And then he wrote a very, 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 very severe letter that he mentions in 2 Corinthians 2:4. I wrote you out of much anguish of heart and with many tears. Then we're talking about more letters than just 2 letters like you got them in the New Testament, okay? Logically speaking. Have I said anything unlogical yet? I hope not, okay? Maybe I will later, but not yet. So this has given rise, given that there are some rough transitions, especially in 2 Corinthians, and we believe there are also rough transitions in 1 Corinthians, this has given rise to many partition theories. And so if you have that piece of paper, the one that's 2 pages, where it says other partition theories of the Corinthian correspondence, look at all these partition theories, and these are reasonable people. By the way, that's a coffee stain, sorry. Anyway, here's the coffee. Johannes Weiss wrote a wonderful commentary on 1 Corinthians, which has never really been excelled. It's still in print. And then Walter Schmidtals was the student of Rudolf Bultmann, who was a student of Weiss. And he wrote a book, a dissertation under Bultmann, Weiss's student, called Gnosticism in Corinth. And you can see he divides 1 and 2 Corinthians into A, B, C, D, E, and F. In other words, the earlier in the alphabet it is, it's an earlier letter. And then Jean Herring, who was a Protestant who taught in either Switzerland or France. Jean Herring wrote a commentary on 1 and 2 Corinthians. And he divided not only 2 Corinthians up, which most of us divide up 2 Corinthians. That is the norm. But dividing up 1 Corinthians has not been the norm. So Jean Herring did that too. Do you notice that in Weiss and in Schmidtals and in Herring that they put 1 Corinthians 11 first? They put it in as part of an early letter, and I'm going to show you later why you would want to do that. And then there's also Wolfgang Schenk, who was an East German who taught in Göttingen for a while, and then he was a really good scholar. Walter Schmidhals wrote another book in which he divided up Corinthians into 13 letters, which no one has taken seriously. And then Philip Fehlhauer wrote a book called The History of Early Christian Literature. And it was an intro to the New Testament. And look at what Philip Fehlhauer says. Letter A is 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 34. And then Dieter Georgi divided up 2 Corinthians. And then Christoph Senft wrote a commentary. He also is a Francophone Swiss scholar. Before he died, he revised it. And so 1 Corinthians 11 is letter A2. So you can see that those of us who divide up 1 Corinthians, we want to put 1 Corinthians 11 first. Okay? Now, if you look at our partition theory, the Jewett-Hughes partition theory, Bob Jewett told me, why don't you call it the Hughes-Jewett? And I said, it was your theory first. He said, don't you agree with it? And I said, yes, but it was your theory first. So anyway, look at letter A, and you can see that letter A in our theory is 1 Corinthians 11, and then we stick in a little bit of 1 Corinthians 16, 1 through 4 in there, and we reverse the two halves of the proof. But you can see that along with many other people who partitioned 1 Corinthians, we want to put 1 Corinthians 11 first. And I'm going to explain to you why. But almost everybody, I mean, a large majority of people partition 2 Corinthians for very good reasons. And the majority view is you shouldn't partition 1 Corinthians. And so I'm going to take a lot of heat for this one. Since Bob Jewett died in December over a year ago, I'm the one that's going to take the heat. But I just want to tell you that unity theories are theories too. It's equally theoretical to say that 1 Corinthians is a single letter. Why? The copies that we have of the Corinthian letters that are used to make the Greek New Testament, most of the earliest ones come from the 4th century CE, 4th and 5th century CE. The big unsealed manuscripts of the entire New Testament come from the 4th and 5th centuries CE. We do have some papyrus copies of P46, Papyrus 46, but you cannot really date P46 before 200 CE, which is to say the end of the 2nd century. So if Paul died in 62, you had the better part of 140 years before P46, the earliest copy of Paul's letters that we have, was penned. See? So there's lots of time between Paul's letter writing and the manuscripts that we have for editing to take place. Okay? And in our book, Bob Jewett describes particularly the editing, well, there's much to be said about that book. The notion that 1 and 2 Corinthians are integral letters written entirely by Paul to a particular church at one time, that is a theory too. Both a unity theory and a partition theory, they are equally theoretical. And so what you have to do is look at the evidence and see what is most likely true based on how you are reading the letter, okay? And if you can do that, then I guess you can be a New Testament scholar too. But neither unity theories, which is the majority view, nor partition theories, which is the minority view, neither unity theories nor partition theories have been proven to everyone's liking. We don't agree. We have to therefore look at the text that we have and come to our best judgment as to how they were originally written and how they may have been edited. And so theories like this are helpful if they help you and me to understand the texts that we are trying to read and understand. And so the theory is good if it helps you understand the text. And if it doesn't help you understand the text, you can decide whether it's good or not. But here, let me show you one of the roughest transitions in 2 Corinthians. In 2 Corinthians 6, 11 through 13, which is, as we believe, this is the end of letter E. It sounds like the very much of a climax of a letter. And so we say, our mouth is open to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide. In return, widen your hearts also. And if you were to omit 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 7:1, which, by the way, is the most difficult passage in Corinthians by far, and go directly to 2 Corinthians 2:4, after he has said in 6:13, widen your hearts also, then in 7:2, open your hearts to us. We have wronged no one. We have corrupted no one. We have taken advantage of no one. And he goes on to say, I am full of joy. And so it is the climax of a letter. It's the peroratio of a letter. And so 6:14 through 7:1 is all about do not be mismated with unbelievers. And it just 6:14 through 7:1 doesn't fit where it sits there in 2 Corinthians. Another one, more well known perhaps, is 2 Corinthians 2:14. By the way, at the beginning of Pauline letters, after the epistolary prescript, Paul to the Corinthians, greetings, there is something called the Thanksgiving prayer. And in the Thanksgiving prayer, that's where the vital theme of the letter is stated. That was shown in 1939 in his famous book by Paul Schubert, The Form and Function of the Pauline Thanksgivings. And so we look for a Thanksgiving prayer at the beginning of letters, and we don't usually have two of them. 2 Corinthians at the very beginning has a Thanksgiving prayer, and if you keep reading in 2:14, you got another Thanksgiving prayer that states different themes. So anyway, 2:12 through 13, when I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, a door was opened for me in the Lord, but my spirit could not rest. You know that Paul usually talks about flesh versus spirit? Remember that? There was no rest in my spirit because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I took leave of them and went on to Macedonia. And then if you omit 2:14 through 7:4, which has nothing to do with what has preceded it, and start reading again at 2 Corinthians 7:5, even when we came into Macedonia, there was no rest in our flesh, for we were afflicted at every turn, fightings without and fear within. And then later, as he goes on in chapter 7, he talks about how wonderful it was that he found Titus. So the narrative, which began earlier than 2:12 in 2 Corinthians, is interrupted in 2:14 through 7:4 by something completely different, including a Thanksgiving prayer, which normally introduces the vital themes of a new letter, see? And then 7:5, it goes back to what he was talking about in 1:1 through 2:13. Okay, that's a very famous splice, and many people believe in that. Okay, there are some other things that don't fit. Let's take a look at 1 Corinthians 11. And I'm going to tell you, here's what the real problem with 1 Corinthians 11 is. If you have a Bible in 1 Corinthians 11, 18 and following, it says, I'm looking at verse 17, in the following instructions I do not commend you, because when you come together it is not for the better but for the worse. You know that some serious stuff is coming now, right? So, 11:18, for to begin with, when you come together as a church, I am hearing that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part. To some extent, I believe it. Indeed, in other words, he's not overly concerned about the divisions, and he only partly believes it. I believe it in part. I kind of believe it, right? Indeed, there do have to be factions among you. In other words, factions actually are not so bad. This is how you tell who the genuine people are. Indeed, there have to be factions among you, for only so will it become clear who among you are genuine. Now, I can go with that, but in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4 of 1 Corinthians, ostensibly the same letter as this, chapters 1 through 4, Paul has raked them over the coals fairly unmercifully because of their divisions. Divisions are dividing up the body of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? I thank God I didn't baptize any of you except the house of Stephanas. The divisions that Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians 1:10, I am of Paul, I am of Cephas, I am of Apollos, and even I am of Christ. Paul doesn't think there's anything good about divisions. And yet in 1 Corinthians 11, 18, and 19, he said, I hear there's divisions among you and I partly believe it. Can that be in the same letter as 1 Corinthians chapters 1 through 4? I don't think so. I don't think it is likely. I mean, it's possible, but I don't think it's likely. The other thing is that 1 Corinthians 11 had to do with haircuts. And when you were growing up, ladies, how many of you believed that to come to an Episcopal church you had to wear a doily on your head? You believed you wore a veil. That's how it used to be. Men like me used to refer to them as doilies, but they were really chapel caps or something. And choir, they had beanies that matched the cassock, right, for ladies in the choir. Let's just say that when women started being ordained in the 70s, pretty much those chapel caps and beanies and doilies kind of went by the wayside. Well, the reason why people wore veils is that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11, women's heads should be covered. Women's heads should be covered, but the word for veil doesn't actually occur in the Greek text. And so what happens is that the covering of the women's head was not actually veils, but covered with elaborate hairstyles. Women coiled or braided their long hair on the tops of their heads, and women did not have short hairstyles. It was considered masculine to have short hairstyles. And apparently there were some women in the Corinthian church that started having bobbed hair, and that caused quite a bit of consternation. So the hairstyles, 1 Corinthians 11 is not women wearing veils. 1 Corinthians 11 is about women wearing masculine-looking hairstyles. Women wore long hair braided in one way or another, and men wore short hair down from the head. And it was considered disgraceful to have long hair and not bound up in some way. You know, if you had long hair, you tied it up so that it was not going everywhere. And a lot has been written about that. Disorderly hair was perceived as disgraceful. I'm sure that the current Prime Minister of Great Britain would be considered disgraceful, etc. Anyway, so if you believe what I've just told you, this is a Bob Jewett slide, by the way. It should not be your head covered. It doesn't mean wearing a veil. It means having your head covered with hair. And so 11:4 of 1 Corinthians 11, any man who prays or prophesies with long hair dishonors his head, but any woman who prays or prophesies with hair falling loose dishonors her head. It is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a woman will not bind her hair up, she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to be shorn or shaven, let her bind her hair up. For a man ought not to bind his hair up, since he is the image and glory of God, etc. So what Paul was really talking about, we believe, and it's not just Bob Jewett and me, is about hairstyles and masculine hairstyles versus feminine hairstyles. And then he goes on to there, by the way, if women were never involved in ministry and worship in the church, in other words, if they were never reading scripture or praying, why is it that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11 that a woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered? So women actually were doing ministry in Pauline congregations. And probably a woman took the letter to the Romans and actually delivered the letter. Phoebe, the diakonos. By the way, there's no word for deaconess in the New Testament, but diakonos is the same word that Paul uses for himself and Apollos in 1 Corinthians 3. So in any event, there's been some mistranslation going on. And so the other thing is that when the Bible was translated into Latin in the 2nd century in what's called the Vetus Latina, the Old Latin, they started using velatum, meaning veiled. That's a perfect passive participle for the verb to veil. Let a woman be veiled. Is it appropriate for a woman not veiled to pray to God? That's how it was translated into Latin, both the Old Latin and Jerome's retranslation in the 4th century in the Vulgate. The Greek text does not use a term for a veil such as kalama. It simply says your hair should be covered. And so the contrast is in 1 Corinthians 11:14. It's a dishonor for a man to have long hair, and for a woman long hair is her glory. Now, I agree with my teacher, Bob Jewett, who says this is the flakiest thing that Paul ever wrote. And I agree that he is correct on that. I agree with him on most things. Anyway, this letter, 1 Corinthians 11, predates most of 1 Corinthians. Because in 1 Corinthians 11, 18 and 19, he said, I've heard there are divisions among you, and I only partly believe it. By the way, divisions are not so bad. You have to believe that that's in the same letter as chapters 1 through 4, where divisions are terrible. Divisions are breaking up the church. They're very bad. And so, is it likely that the same Paul would have written 1 through 4, decrying how bad divisions were, and then in 11, 18, and 19 say, well, they're not so bad? See? So that's the big problem, and that's the reason why both Bob Jewett and I, and almost everybody on that other list of partition theories, why we want to put 1 Corinthians 11 first. See? What that means is Paul is writing at a time that he doesn't really understand how deep the divisions were. See? So anyway, as a result of Paul and his letters, Paul was not only the author of the earliest Christian literature to be written, namely his letters were written in the 50s, but also the earliest to be collected and recognized as Holy Scripture by the early church. And then his legacy is very important. He's considered the most successful missionary in the history of the church. His mission was mostly to Gentiles. By the way, in Galatians 1:16, he talks about the revelation of Christ to him, and he says, this happened in order that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. So Paul understands his mission as being to the Gentiles. He was the most responsible person for the establishment of Christianity as being a religion separate from Judaism, which was probably not his goal. Traditionally, Paul is considered the father of Christian theology, and Jimmy Dunn, who died a couple of years ago from the University of Durham in England, wrote a book called The Theology of Paul the Apostle, and he refers to Paul as the first and greatest Christian theologian. So, what we're looking at is the question of the literary integrity. And so, Professor Jewett and I have come up with this theory. This is really his theory. And then when I became his doctoral student and started doing rhetorical criticism, you can not only do rhetorical criticism of full integral letters, you could also do rhetorical criticism of these letter fragments and see if they have rhetorical coherence. And that's what we did. And that's what's in chapters 5 through 12 of our book. So anyway, we are into the partition theory, And this is what we can consider Corinthian letter A. And so, given the time, I'm going to have to let you read Corinthian letter A on your own. And then for next week, I'm going to let you read 1 Corinthians Corinthian letter B. And that's the letter that we identify with what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5:9. I wrote you to stay away from immoral people. So 1 Corinthians 5:9 refers to a letter against porneia, immoral behavior. And we think that the letter mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5:9 is what we call letter B. Okay? So anyway, you get to read letter A and letter B and see if you think we are making any sense to you. Okay? And some of you will agree, I think, and some of you may very well disagree. Okay. I think we have to quit. We'll put some of these slides in our thing for next week. So for next week, take our partition theory, read letter A, and then read letter B, and see if you can detect a difference in tone.